Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bite Your Tongue, the podcast. I'm Denise.
And I'm Kirsten, and we hope you will join us as we explore the ins and outs of building healthy relationships with our adult children.
Together, we'll speak with experts, share heartfelt stories, and get timely advice addressing topics that matter most to you.
Get ready to dive deep and learn to build and nurture deep connections with our adult children, and of course, when to bite our tongues.
So let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bite Your Tongue, the podcast. I'm Denise, and as always, I'm joined by my fabulous co-host, Kirsten Heckendorf. There she is, waving. Hi, Kirsten. Good morning. Happy New Year. Before we dive into today's episode, we want to share something. Over the past month, we've received more messages from listeners than we ever have before. And I think it's because in the episode notes, there's a little call to action that says, send us a text. We do love hearing from you, but you have to know that this platform, Send Us a Text, doesn't let us know who's sending these texts, so we can't reply. We love to get them. We love to hear what you're thinking, but we can't reply to you. We can respond if you reach out through our website or email, and you can email us at biteyourtonguepodcast@gmail.com. When you use that channel or our website, biteyourtonguepodcast.com, we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. Now let's jump into today's episode. Kirsten, why don't you get us started?
Great. And thank you, Denise, and Happy New Year to you as well. Today's topic hits really close to home for me, both friends who have been victims as well as friends of my daughters during college specifically. And these are crucial conversations we need to learn how to have with our adult children so that they do feel comfortable talking to us. And I think it's one that's unfortunately often kept in the shadows. So today we're talking about sexual abuse and how it can impact our relationships with our adult children. According to RAINN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 26 men will experience an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. Today's episode will shed light on how to have these difficult conversations that surround sexual abuse and assault. Today, we're joined by Karen Denison Clark, a woman whose journey embodies courage and advocacy. She's here to help parents of adult children understand the profound impact of sexual abuse and how to foster conversations with our children about this sensitive topic. She's going to be sharing a really deeply personal story and one that she repressed for many, many, many years before finally speaking out. Her experience has shaped her life and her relationships, but she's now using it as a catalyst for change, especially with survivors of abuse by trusted adults.
This is amazing, Kirsten. I think that statistic by RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. What the heck is going on? So I'm really glad we're talking about it. Before we introduce Karen, though, I want to tell you just a little more about her and why this episode's so important. In early December of this year, Karen was featured in a major New York Times story written by Matt Fetterman. And the story was titled, "Two Women Lived with the Secret of an Assault by the Same Tennis Coach. Then They Found Each Other." Everyone should read this, and we'll definitely put the link in our episode notes. The story itself is alarming, but just as alarming are the hundreds of comments by readers. It's hard to believe the number of women that commented on this story, that talked about suffering quietly, being sexually assaulted not only by coaches, but teachers, camp counselors, family members, and friends. I never understood how they hold it in, don't share it with their families, with anyone, and don't seek support. They say it's their word against the perpetrator. The reaction to this in just this one article is remarkable. And I really hope that this episode helps all of us to learn how to bring this up with our adult children and help change the landscape for our grandchildren and our future generations. It's been going on way too long. All right, now a little bit about Karen. She was born in Washington. She grew up as a local tennis star before literally joining the national circuit at age 14. At 15, she was at a tennis camp. Her coach from New Zealand, and I'm just going to say his name, Lou Gerard, a former 11th ranked player in the world, offered to coach her. And he was a fabulous coach and took her game to the next level, earning her a ranking and setting her on the path to play professionally. However, at the age of 16, he sexually assaulted her, altering her life forever. Her tennis career, as she knew it, was over. She's now an advocate for the safeguarding of women through speaking, writing, podcasts, and lobbying for legislative change. A mother of three and grandmother of three, we'll learn why she is speaking out now and how we as parents can create a supportive environment for our adult children and grandchildren. It's really shocking, Kirsten. I'm so glad to do this episode. It's a little out of our normal, but I think it's important.
I don't know that I think it's so abnormal. We talk a lot about other things that are not something that you and I have necessarily experienced, but that I do think other parents have experienced. And I also wonder if there isn't some silence that takes place amongst those parents as well. They also don't feel comfortable saying, yeah, my kid was sexually assaulted. And it's not our story to tell. It's our
Right,
kid's story
right.
to tell.
That's true.
It's so complicated, but I do think it fits with what we talk about with adult children and how we communicate with them.
Absolutely.
So, welcome, Karen. You have bravely shared your story with the media, including the Denver Post and the New York Times. Your story is so compelling and your advocacy is inspiring. We're so grateful to have you here to share your journey and those insights. We also want to know how you shared this with your own children and how your work impacts your grandchildren. Can you tell us what drives your passion for sharing your story so publicly? Walk us through your journey a little bit and why you think it's so critical to bring these issues to the forefront.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is definitely a passion of mine. When something like this has happened in your life and you've kept it hidden for 50 years, it is so healing to get your word out. My reason for this is I don't want it to happen to anybody else. I want to deter the behavior. I want women to speak up and feel like they can, because I think I was raised in the say nothing generation, and I want that to change. I know how healing it's been for me, and I want other women to be able to feel that. And a big thing is our grandchildren. It's the next generation. Like, it's too late for us, even for our own. Most of our children are millennials. They've probably already been assaulted if they were going to get assaulted. So we can help them by talking to them, but it's really about our grandchildren and the next generation, because I believe that's where the change can be made.
So, Karen, walk us through your story. I know that particularly in the most recent article in the Denver Post, there was a lot of it, but I think hearing it firsthand from you for our listeners would be a great help before we jump into some of the questions we have for you.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., the Mid Atlantic region for tennis in our country. And I was a pretty talented tennis player, junior, and I went to a camp. I was already really highly ranked in the region. And I go to this camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia when I was 15 years old. Dennis Vandermeer camp, who was really a well known coach. I met Lou Gerard there at 15. I can look back now and say, I think the grooming started that week. I had taken a train down to Sweetbriar College, which was where the camp was, and he offered to drive me home from camp. He was taking another camper, a male camper, so back to Baltimore, where he was from, and he got to meet my mom. So my mom didn't have to pick me up at the train station. She was like, this is all great. And started working with him. He was saying, I want to work with your daughter. She has such great potential. I started working with him right away. My mother loved him. He was from New Zealand. He was this world ranked player, so he had the accent, and he was as charming as they come, which most perpetrators are really charming. And I started working with him right away. He took my game to the next level. That fall, I'm 6 of 7 children. I had an older sister. My oldest sister was married with 2 kids at the time. She lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Lou was giving an adult clinic at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville. And that's where the abuse took place. He was just so good at saying, hey, I can help you do this, and come down to Charlottesville. And my mom drove me down. I didn't even have my license yet, and stayed with my sister. The Friday night, he said to come after the adult clinic, and we'll work, I'll train with you. We'll have a lesson. And I remember the lesson being shorter than I thought it would be. Like it was always an hour. And I know it felt like 30 minutes, but maybe it was 45. And then he said he needed to go to the tavern to socialize a bit with the adult campers from that weekend. And we go, and he's like, I'll take you back to your sister's after that. We go to this tavern. I can remember a low coffee table and all these, adult tennis players. I'm 15 at the time, Lou's in his mid 30s. And he puts this small glass with a brown drink in front of me. And I'd never had a mixed drink before, but I knew it was like bourbon, whiskey, something like that. I drink it. I don't remember ever getting another drink. And the next thing I remember is I'm still at the tavern and there's no one there. Everyone's gone. Lou then says he needs to run by his room to get something before he takes me to my sister's. And I can remember him holding me up, like kind of behind my arm at my elbow. And I'm having trouble walking. And I can remember these white walls and this green rug. And I'm going down the hallway. And the next thing I remember, I am flopped back on a bed. My tennis skirt is at my knees. And he's wiping my stomach with Kleenex. I remember going home and not a word was said in the car. I can remember it was fall, so there were a lot of leaves, and he's helping me get to my sister's house and walking up the walkway, and I'm shuffling through leaves. I go inside, and I remember when I woke up the next morning thinking, I can never tell anyone what happened. And I was just frozen in fear. But I went on.
I was going to say, you continued to train with him.
I did. And nothing was ever said. Nothing. So it was, he never tried it again, which when I finally got into therapy, she was like, that's pretty unusual because usually that's kind of the beginning of more abuse. And so somehow I let him know this was never going to happen. But anyway, I go on, I continue training with him. Nothing is ever said. The following summer, I have the best summer of my life. I'm ranked in the top 20 in the country in the 16 and unders. And I can remember when the rankings came out at the end of the summer, Lou said to me, and I was top 20, and he said, next year when you're in the 18s, you're going to be in the top 10. And this little voice went off in my head, no, that's not going to happen. And I didn't understand what was happening to me. And like, why was I thinking that? Why didn't I trust him? And, was it a few weeks or maybe a month, but I know that fall, all of a sudden, I could not hold on to a tennis racket. My hands literally, like I could see them shaking. I had no idea what was happening to me. With hindsight now, I can look back and say, I think that was my body saying, you got to get out of there. So my tennis started falling apart. And I kept saying to Lou, what's wrong? What's happening to me? And he was a jerk about it. I would say, he just wasn't helpful. He was just, I don't know. Well, he certainly knew, but he didn't want to say anything. My mother was saying this, what's happened, Karen? What's wrong? And I couldn't tell her. And so to this day, I can feel it today, lying to my mother and feeling horrible about it. I had to get her off my back. And I just said, Mom, I just think I don't like tennis anymore. And then she was like, oh, darling, well, of course you don't need to play tennis, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, that was the biggest lie I've ever told. I love the game. I love the game today. But I didn't know what else to do.
So how many years later, so you repress this, you go through college, you get married, you have your own children. And when does this, because I want to talk a little about of understanding this whole repression and memory, because for those of us that haven't gratefully been exposed, you'll hear stories where someone will pop up 20 years later and say, oh, when I was in fourth grade or when I was 4 years old, and you think to yourself, why are you just talking about it now? So what was your journey to finally come to terms with this? I mean, you remembered it maybe, but you repressed it. Is that right?
I want to add something to that as well. Why did you feel that you couldn't tell anybody? What, if you remember, what was going on in your head? Because I wonder if that also plays a role in allowing your psyche to repress it.
Yeah, I wouldn't, the fear of not being believed. I mean, I think that's the crux of why I kept it silent. And that was proven just this year in Matt Futterman's article. Lou denied he knew me. He denied he'd ever even met me. So what do you think he would have done when I was 15, 16?
Right.
And I knew I had to have known that. But yeah, I will have to say, I had 5 or 6 years after this happened where I to myself, I called them my lost years. I did not have a great college experience. I went to the University of Maryland. I got the first full scholarship for a woman there. I played number one, and I was barely functioning. And at that time in the 70s, I needed to go to Florida, California, or Texas to a good tennis school. Maryland is a good tennis school now, but it was very mediocre in the 70s. So it all looked good on paper. Full scholarship, number one player, blah, blah, blah. I can't even describe. I was just putting one foot in front of the other. I did not have a good experience, even though, you'd look at my record and go, that was pretty decent. I was like struggling to get through each match. I would say about 5 years after, and I'm actually at the end of college, and I feel like I started coming out of it, but I can't even explain to you today how and why that happened. But I started to get better mentally. I eventually meet my husband, I marry, I have children, like Denise just said. And I think something happens in everyone's lives who's experienced a trauma like that triggers them. An event happens. I mean, Pam Shriver, when she came out with her story about her inappropriate relationship with her coach, which is why I was in that article with Pam, is because our coaches were really good friends. She grew up in Baltimore. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was 4 years older. I was the best player in the area, and she looked up to me at the time. And she says in 2020, both her mother died and Don Candy, her coach, had died. And she said that was her trigger. She's in the pandemic. She has all this time to think about her life, and she gets into therapy. For me, it was 2006. I had just started coaching at University of Denver, DU, that year. And I'm coaching with this woman, Amy Jensen. And in just passing conversation, she had graduated from Berkeley, and she had won the NCAAs and doubles 3 years that she was there. And it just comes up in this conversation that actually her freshman year, she played at Wake Forest. And she said, I was recruited. She's Australian and a very funny woman. And she said, I was recruited by this pervert from New Zealand, who then got fired a couple of years later for an inappropriate relationship with a player. And I'm looking at her like I'm looking at you right now, and there is no change in my expression. And I knew exactly who that pervert from New Zealand was. I knew he had an enormously successful career at Wake Forest. I knew all that. Obviously, that was my trigger, but I couldn't deal with it right then. And I go home. I know exactly where I was in my house. And I wish I could explain how I cried for close to an hour. I couldn't sit down. I was pacing, but I was buckled over at my waist, and everything is flooding back. And I've never cried like that in my life. I will never cry like that again. I think the biggest thing that day was, oh my God, it wasn't just me. because I thought I was the only one. As Matt Futterman from the New York Times says, Karen, you probably weren't his first either. That was the big revelation, that it wasn't just me. We're talking 26 years from the time he assaulted me to the time he got fired from Wake Forest, which was 99, and this is 2006. And I'm thinking, how many others were there in those 26 years? But I will say, even though that triggered me, I still wasn't ready yet. And I think I wasn't ready because I had high school students at home. I had one who was a freshman in college and two in high school. You're just busy in your life. And I just think I didn't have the space yet. I told my husband that night, but I didn't give him a lot of the details. He knew Lou. I mean, Lou was very well known in the Mid-Atlantic area. My husband, Raoul, was a tennis player as well and had coached with him. I just wasn't ready to give the whole story. So fast forward 9 years, life, it was in my mind, even though I had only told Raoul, but I also had reached out to a therapist I had used years ago. She told me to write him a letter, not send it, and just tell him everything I think of him. So I did that, and I think I'm healed, which was not true. But in 2015, and this is 9 years later, I don't know what brought it out then. It was the year my oldest daughter got married. And I'm like, was there something with that? I don't know. But I just came to my husband and said, I think I need to go to therapy. I think I just need to sit down with somebody and just talk about this. That was almost 9.5 years ago. That was the beginning of the journey that I'm on today. Spent several years in therapy, learned so much, because there's so much in my life that was affected by that day that I had no idea. Like that day was not, or that evening was not just this one thing that happened. It affected my whole life. I'm in therapy and I'm discovering, oh my God, that's why. I have radar, definitely for creepy men. I'm very triggered or sensitive to if I feel like somebody's taking advantage of me. And that I learned in therapy all along the way, like, oh, ooh, that's why I didn't like that person to do that to me. It had nothing to do with abuse or sex, but I was taken advantage of. And I'm really sensitive to that.
So I want to ask a couple things, or say a couple things. One is, I want to talk about what that journey is now, the reason we're having this podcast, and what we hope our listeners can do and understand to make a change in this. But the other thing I want to bring up that we haven't mentioned was the op-ed you wrote in the Denver Post. My husband, myself, anyone I've shared this with is shocked that CU and DU, so University of Colorado, University of Denver, you're in that area, both do not prohibit relationships between coaches, professors, whoever it might be, and their students and their teammates or whatever. They, from what I read and you sent to me, they have to report it, but the relationship can still go on. That seems so out of whack to me, based on everything that's going on with this whole Me Too and people in power. I mean, how can you be a player and have a relationship with a coach? How can you be a student and be sleeping with your professor and have that be okay?
Well, first off, it's not okay. We know that. Obviously, that's why I write the op-ed. I was as shocked as anybody that this actually, and I wrote it in 2024, that it was actually 2024, and this is really, the case. So I wrote this op-ed, and CSU, I will say, Colorado State, prohibits this, and every year you have, if you're a professor, coach, a supervisor of somebody, you have to sign a document every year, because that reminds you that this is not allowed at our school. Personally, I think with DU and CU right now, they don't want to change it, because then they would be admitting they were wrong, that this is not a good policy. And then I think in their world, that opens them up to a lawsuit.
Okay. Do you
If,
know at all other colleges across the US what the norm is?
well, I think it's changing. I think it is moving to prohibiting, but I think there's also many schools that just, these policies are in place and they just leave them alone. I mean, I think originally the policies were that these are consenting adults, blah, blah, blah. So you can have a relationship with your coach or professor, but you legally can't drink in college. I mean, that's ridiculous. I'm going to guess that they're going to slowly change these policies, but they just don't want anybody to know and make a big deal out of it. But I certainly will be. I mean, I'm not done yet with DU. And yeah, I just think there's a lot of things that they just look the other way.
As you said earlier, you weren't the first, and
Mhm.
all of us have, well, Kirsten has adult daughters. Well, even men, we were quoting those statistics. One in, what was it, 6 women every 68 seconds, and one in 28 men or something. So
26
even
men.
young boys are being assaulted. Is there a way we can bring this up to our adult kids and talk about it? So, number one, they're aware, or if they want to talk to us, or two, if they're having children, how they approach their grandchildren, what are the changes that we need to see made and how we can help?
Yeah, I believe so. With our own adult children, we've kind of already raised them and however we raised them. But that doesn't mean we can't now say, but you as either a parent or you're eventually going to be a parent, this is a critical subject and it all goes down to communication. I mean, pretty much, I think everything in life goes down to communication. We chose to bring children into this world. We did not do this just to house them and feed them. Our responsibility as a parent is to mentor our children. If we didn't mentor them very well growing up, it's not too late. And it's hard. Communication, and this is a difficult subject to talk about. But I think what you were doing here and what I'm doing is opening up that jar to talk about that, because one of the things I can say is I listen to this podcast and let me tell you what I learned. It's having these conversations with your children, and then what I want to work on is how we then get the next generation educated, comfortable with speaking up, and in an age appropriate way. Parents Driver was like by middle school, that's when we got to get these kids at middle school. I totally agree. That's when I think between the ages of 13 and 15 are pretty common ages for girls to be assaulted. But there's just horrific stories of 5 and 6 year olds get assaulted.
Right. And that's the other thing. So I think, Karen, both of your parents passed. They never knew. I have, since you started talking about this to me, I've spoken to a few other friends that then have shared their journey. I had known something happened, but they didn't really open up about the whole thing. All of their parents passed. They never shared it. Do you think it would have helped if you would have talked to your mother about it? Or what are your feelings about never sharing this with your mother? Do you think sometimes as a young adult, you don't want to share the bad things with your parents because you don't want to make them sad? You don't want to make them feel guilty? Like maybe she would have thought, why wasn't I there for Karen? Why didn't I see this? What are some of the reasons you think you don't even feel like you want to tell your parents?
It's interesting because my mother, when I got into therapy in 2015, was in her early 90s. I so badly wanted to tell her. And my therapist said, mm-mm.
Really?
Well, she was beginning to have short-term memory loss. My fear was she would say, did you tell me that Lou Gerard assaulted you? And then
Yeah.
5 minutes later, she'd say, did you?
Yeah, yeah.
I get it, but I wanted to tell her so badly because I think it would connect a lot of dots for her, but I didn't. And but what do I think?
Yeah, like
Like
today, should we talk to our adult? I mean, after this conversation, is it worth? I have adult daughter and adult son saying I had this conversation with Karen Clark, blah blah blah. Here are the articles. You should read these. Did anything ever happen to you in your life? I was also talking to someone else that realized just recently through therapy and everything that there was all these assaults going on her childhood street.
Playing bridge one weekend up in the mountains. There's 4 of us, and I'm telling my story, and someone else says she was raped by her roommate's boyfriend right after college. Then this other woman was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but nothing had ever happened to me." Well, the next morning, she can't wait to tell us that she gets in bed and realizes that there's all these different levels of assaults, that she was
Right.
definitely assaulted. And she said, "I've had 2 assaults. One was worse than the other, but I'm shocked that I just never thought it was an assault." I have a daughter, because when I got in therapy, I went back to Rao and told him the whole story. And one of the biggest questions he asked me, which goes back to the repression thing, was, well, so we'd been married 24 years when I first told him, but I didn't give him the details. And so then it was probably 33 years later that I really gave him the whole story. One of his first questions was, "Well, Karen, earlier in our marriage, did you think about it and just not say anything?" And I was like, "No, I really had put it in that file cabinet, locked the file cabinet, and thrown away the key." But I mean, definitely there's that book, Your Body Keeps the Score. And it was in me. And I feel like it just needed to come out. It was probably going to come out one way or another. And Amy Jensen just helped that process, even though I wasn't ready when I was first triggered by it. I think an easy way to ask, you can add on, has anything like this happened to you or anyone else you know?
Or anyone else you know.
Because it's almost, I think, easier for one of our adult children to say, "Oh, I have so many friends that this has happened to." And I want to get rid of all inappropriate behavior, because that's where it all begins.
You said something earlier about the degrees of what constitutes an assault. So how do you teach your daughters, and then in turn they teach other people, what they're looking for? How do you categorize this? How do you say that's assault?
I think if it's inappropriate, it's inappropriate. A lot of it goes back to sexual comments, because not all sexual comments turn into a sexual assault, but all sexual assaults start with sexual comments. I think we as a society, the boys will be boys. It's just a joke. Those kinds of things. I'm hoping that my grandchildren's generation will say, "No, that's not funny." And put the shame where it needs to be, not on the women who laugh it off. One of the Wake Forest players who did speak, I was disappointed. A lot of the Wake Forest players did not want to speak about their own teammate that was assaulted, because I think, and this goes to something else that we had talked about, I think as you age, you're more open to talking about this stuff. And I feel like the Wake Forest women are still in like their late 40s, early 50s, and they're still busy with kids or their career or both. And I think when you get space in your life, whatever age that is, but let's just throw out 60, then you start looking back on this kind of stuff and realizing what may have happened that you just ignored, or I don't want this to happen to my grandchildren. I mean, that's huge. I have 2 granddaughters. They're 7 and 4. I have yet to tell them my story, but I will tell them my story when, in an age appropriate way, when I feel like they can absorb it. I want to write. I mean, I have a website now and I'm writing blogs on that, but I have in my head this, like a handbook called Red Flags, as a way to educate it and have it in an age appropriate way. And my daughter, probably 2 months after I told her about my assault, she comes to me, she's late 20s then, and she's crying and she said, "Mom, I've been assaulted." And I was like, "What?" And she says, "Well, I never really thought it was an assault because nothing happened." And she starts crying and she tells me the story that, long story, it was in college, it was a day party, drinking, a guy's giving her a ride back into town. They get to a stop sign. He takes her ponytail and yanks her down to his crotch and says, "It's time now to give me a blowjob." She fought him, and she said, and she's crying and crying, and she's telling me how she fought him off, how they get to the next stop sign, the car is moving, and she jumps out of the car. And she's crying and saying, Mom, I never would have fought back like that if you weren't my mother. She didn't know my story. One of the biggest questions what my therapist had asked me was, how did I teach my daughter? I have 2 daughters and a son. How did I teach my daughters when I hadn't shared my story? And what did I tell them about sexual assault and sexually inappropriate behavior? And, I looked at her and went, I don't know. But as my daughter pointed out to me in her late 20s, I definitely let my daughters know, you don't let anyone take advantage of you. I mean, there was definitely we'll come get you at any time.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
was definitely, I was always said, just blame it on your mother. If you're ever in an uncomfortable position, say, well, my mom wants me to blah, 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 and make up anything. And there was always that. But I think somehow I let my girls know that inappropriate behavior by guys was not okay.
Karen, the whole red flag thing and everything, I get all that, but I think the bigger issue, truly, and I don't know what your plans are for this or how it can be changed, is the he said, she said. You never think you're going to be believed. I still remember I was nursing my son, so I think I watched every William Kennedy Smith was when Court TV was big, okay?
Oh, yeah, that was.
And he had raped this woman on the beach. It was very clear that he had raped this woman on the beach, but it was a he said, she said, and you get into court and you're rarely proven that it happened. You know what I mean? The woman, she's dragged through the mud in a way that nobody wants to talk about it or come forward.
That is true, particularly on college campuses today, particularly when there's drinking involved. It's always the woman's responsibility to prevent any of this from happening. Well, why is that? That's what I do believe could change. But
I hope so, because
it's going to take a while. But if we educate our young ones now, before this can happen, I do think that the tide can change. Let me tell you, we need men to help us through this. I think the Me Too movement was the beginning, and then it's kind of had good moments, and then you think it's falling back, and then it's another good movement. Well, that's just how I think grassroots movements happen. And I think we're in the early stages of that. Do I want it to happen much quicker than it is? Yes. But wouldn't it be great if the she says were starting to be believed more? And I do think they are, compared to the William Kennedy Smith days.
Well, but even Kavanaugh, even Hill, Justice Thomas and Anita Hill. I think about those boys, that girl from Stanford that was basically, wasn't she like completely behind a building and completely out of it? They still raped her, 3 guys from some team. Yeah. It's a hard battle. I commend you for what you're doing. I think bringing it up is so important. I just think we've got to encourage women to speak up and also figure out how we can support them when they're speaking up.
And if men start to be held accountable, then that can also shift things. Look, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think there was a chance for change. I mean, I'm not going to leave this earth without fighting for this to be changed. I will say, this is another point too. I do think, and I am a glasses half full kind of person, the comment section of my most recent article in the New York Times, there were many men who commented. They would have to be young fathers who say, this terrifies me, that it could possibly happen to one of my daughters. That's the guy. I want to talk to those guys. Yeah. My own son-in-law that has these 2 daughters. He's the perfect example. My daughter says even in her book club, this kind of stuff comes up more than you would think. I think that's awesome. She says a lot of her friends who are raising boys are like, we don't want you to be the boys will be boys kind of kids. That's very encouraging. I just posted on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook my article just a few days ago. It took me the holidays and whatever. I wanted to make sure I put a caption underneath that was meaningful. And I've been blown up.
When
Two texts this morning by two friends of mine, not close friends, but two friends in Denver, said, can we meet for coffee? One of them said, she was a good junior tennis player. And she said, two of my coaches were abusers. The other woman I know, she was raped at a young age.
Well, you are taking the cap off the bottle, girl, or letting the genie out. I don't know how you say it. I never use the right things. We really commend you. And I hope if we do anything with this podcast, we inspire all of our listeners to help all of the women around them and men be stronger and take care of themselves. So we need to move on. And I want to ask you to leave our listeners with two takeaways that you think you want them to take away from this conversation, other than what I would like them to take away is, here's a woman that has exposed so much about herself, fighting to make a huge difference. And we really are grateful to you for that, Karen. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. This is what it's about, though. It's like using our voices, because I feel like anyone that's been assaulted, but even if you weren't assaulted, I think we were not raised to have our voices be heard.
We were scared.
And I think it's time. I think women have a lot of good things to say in every avenue, not just this horrific situation. But I feel like nothing changes when things are hidden. And to anybody that's out there listening, nothing will change if you keep this hidden. But if you bring it out, it's so good for the person bringing it out. That's healing, but it's also good for everybody else. That's a huge piece of it. And then the second takeaway is that next generation. That's what we've got to focus on. They're our future. I know that's a very cliche thing to say, but if we can teach the next generation that their voices matter and that they can be believed, because I think you can speak up, but if you're not believed, then you think, well, why did I ever speak up? Listen to your children and talk to them and communicate with them.
And Karen, if people want to find you, do you want to tell them your website? I'm sure on their website there's some contact information, because my guess is listeners may want to share their story with you.
Absolutely. It is a developing website. We're working on it, but it's KarenDenisonClark.com. KarenDen, one N in the middle, ISON, Clark.com. And there, you can email me at Karen@KarenDenisonClark.com. I've got about 3 blogs up there. I'm going to be posting this podcast on there, and I would love it for anybody. Don't hesitate to reach out for me, because you never know where it could lead and who I might know and what you can do together.
Right. Karen, thank you so much for this. This was really great. And I'm impressed by your honesty and how much you are exposing to make a difference. So it means a lot to all of us and to all of our daughters and grandchildren.
Yeah, it's for the future. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Karen. Well, that's a wrap.
That was quite an interesting episode. Important to acknowledge that this is going on. It's a tough one. She's climbing a very steep battle, but I give her a lot of credit.
Yeah, it's a tough subject, but I think she's correct that communication is key, and creating those safe spaces so that our girls, women, and men who are assaulted, I think that they're more likely to speak up. I don't think we've created yet the right kind of environment. I love her idea of doing a red flags book to lay out what is assault, what does it look like? If you get that uncomfortable feeling, there's a reason for it. Those kinds of things would be super helpful.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, it's a lot. For those listeners who may want to reach Karen, please visit her website. Again, that is KarenDenisonClark.com. We will share her email in our episode notes as well. She would welcome your thoughts and any shared experiences.
I think those shared experiences are key, because that's the only way. I think that she got all these emails after her Facebook and LinkedIn posts, and she can build a community, even with some of the people that made the comments. I just want to quickly, before we close, touch base on the listener questions, and we can't reply to those texts, as I said. So many of those messages were about estrangement. It just seems that we get this over and over again, and we've explored this in depth. season 2, episode 41 with Carl Pillimer, and then season 3, episode 62 with Joshua Coleman. I would start with that first. Hopefully we'll get to something more on that at some point. We've received someone estrangement from their oldest son and his wife. Another one was sibling jealousy. We haven't really talked about that at all. And the impact of an abusive father. The mother possibly not supporting the child. Those are all good questions and things that we'll keep top of mind. Finally, if you just send us a text and tell us you're enjoying the podcast, we love it. The kind words make us very happy. And so your support truly keeps us going.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. You can email us at biteyourtonguepodcast@gmail.com. And if you found any value in today's episode, please support us by visiting biteyourtonguepodcast.com and buying us a virtual cup of coffee. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. As we close, we also want to thank Connie Gorant-Fisher, our audio and production engineer. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And until next time,
Remember, throughout your life, your relationship with your adult kids, sometimes you just have
you
to
just
bite
have to
your
bite your
tongue.
tongue.